Good morning.
Okay, we're on bottom page item of base 87B.
Again, they have one of their cutesy little charts.
Yeah.
Uh, More complicated.
4 lines to the bottom of the page, 87B. So Gemara says mice. So the money that's given to if you're obligated to pay damages to a child, and this is a child who's going to keep the money, right? He's not relying on his father, or even if it is relying on his father, it's a scenario where he would get to keep the money. You put it in a skula. What's a skula? So you buy a Torah scroll. Rabbi, you buy a palm tree, the Achamei Tamri, because you get the benefit of the interest. The interest that would be in dates. Okay.
Don't get a ice storm, you're all right.
Yeah.
With regard to the question, back to the question that we spoke about yesterday, if somebody damages a man's daughter, does the father get to keep the damages? So Shlagash similarly says like Rava. The father only has a right to marry her off or to sell her as a slave. He does not get to keep the damages. Rabbi Yehudah says, "Afilu pitzia." Even if she gets a wound, the father gets to keep it. So Gemara says, "Pitzia is a wound." The Gemara presumes it's a type of wound that does not cause a decrease in value. In other words, it would be understandable to say that if she decreases her value, so you made her less attractive as a slave, so the father would have a right. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Lozer's question of whether or not the father gets to keep the damages to his daughter was only with regard to damages that were permanent, because there it's possible to argue that the father has a hand in that. In the outcome, because his father could otherwise sell her for a slave or marry her off. But if there's long-term damage, you've impacted the father. But if there's no long-term damage, just a wound, there was never a question. So how could Rabbi Yehudah argue that the father's rights over his daughter extend even to damages that even to pain or suffering that didn't cause any permanent damage? So what happened was she got a wound on her face, and that presumably left a permanent scar, and therefore that caused a decrease in value. Even though technically she got a scar on her face from the damage, and that decreased her value in the sense that she's less attractive now as a mate. And because of that, the father is entitled to collect that money on her, the money of the damages that she would have gotten otherwise. Okay, now we take an interesting side turn. Rabbi Yehudah says that a slave does not have embarrassments. 88A.
Yeah.
5 lines down.
Okay.
So it's like we explained. Rabbi Yehudah says that a slave does not have embarrassment. What's the source of this? Is this some sort of logical argument because he's a slave? So Gemara indicates otherwise. My time of Rabbi Yehudah. What's the reason of Rabbi Yehudah? Amar kra ki yinatzu anoshim yachdav. Ish v'ochiv. A man with his brother. Okay, this verse is the verse that talks about embarrassment. It talks about a man and a man. Two men were fighting. Anyway, that one of the men's wives was walking. One of the men's wife was walking by, and they embarrassed her. And the Torah says you have to pay for the embarrassment. But the key component here is it says ish v'ochiv, man and his brother. This excludes a slave which is not called an achiv. He's not called your brother. So there's a Torah exclusion to pull slaves out of the category of embarrassment.
But only a canon.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Rabbanon and the rabbis say that a slave is called achiv. Why? Because achiv hu b'mitzvahs, he's your brother in doing mitzvahs. The slave is obligated with certain mitzvahs. So the Gemara asks, El me'ata Rabbi Yehudah, Zeh me'eved lo haregu, the siv asisim le'kasher samam las achiv. Let's say two witnesses argue that a slave should be killed because he's a murderer, and the slaves turn out to be liars. What does the verse say? We do to them like they wanted to do to their brother. But if a slave is not included in the word brother, so then they shouldn't be killed because they weren't targeting their brother. They were targeting a slave and have Kanani. When the verse states you have to get rid of the evil in your midst, meaning the false witnesses, that includes even witnesses that testify against an Eved Kanani. Okay. So now, according to the rabbis, that an Eved is called your brother, Achiv. A slave should be kosher to be a king. A slave is not kosher to be a king. We had it, I believe, in the end of Kedushin. Toward the end of Kedushin. Was Yanai Hamelach. Yanai Hamelach was a descendant of slaves. Sorry, it was Agrippas Hamelach. Yeah, it was also in the end of Saita. Okay, anyway, I'm Ultamer Tikshilach, Gerrit Divrakal. 1 second. Okay, so in other words, the verse that excludes a slave from being a king is Mikarev Achecha, Tosam Alech Melech. You have to appoint a king, Mikarev Achecha, from amongst your brothers. The rabbis, they'll call a slave your brother, so you should be able to appoint him as a king. So the Gemara's Amri. So what are you going to counter argue? You'll say that an Eved, a slave, is not your brother, like Rabbi Yehudah. This way, it makes sense why he can't be a king. But a convert, according to all opinions. Now, let's explain this. A convert is allowed to be a witness and cannot be a king. Not only can he not be a king, a convert cannot take any position of religious leadership. Convert cannot be a rabbi. He cannot be in any supervising position of religious leadership.
Is that rule in effect today as well?
Correct. In Orthodox circles, absolutely. Yeah. You will not find an Orthodox rabbi who's in a rabbinical position, a bona fide rabbinical position, who's a rabbi, who's
I mean, like of a congregation or
congregational rabbi would be excluded. A school is a little bit different. A teacher of students is not really, it's a rabbinical kind. Correct. Yeah, he has to have rabbinical authority. Teaching students is not considered rabbinical authority. Okay, now regardless, so here's the problem. A slave is kosher to be a witness, right? Clearly, in that context, he's called your brother. But a slave is not kosher to be king or of any other position of religious leadership. So what is he? Is he your brother or is he not your brother?
For certain things, yes, and certain things not.
Well, that's the question. Okay, El Makro, we have to explain. El Makro, when the verse talks about appointing a king, it says Mikarev Achecha, from amongst your brothers. What does that mean? What does amongst mean? From the category of your brothers. Meaning there's a lot of people that tick the box of brother. But when we select the king, it's going to be from amongst that category, meaning we're limiting that category to only a few select individuals that will appoint as king. What does that mean? The most elite ones that are in the category of your brother. And a ger just doesn't make the cut. Okay, Elameat, if that's the case, okay. According to the rabbis, a slave should be kosher for witnesses. A witness testified. He's falsely testified about his brother. Now, if a slave is a brother, then he should be kosher as a witness. Amar Ula says, you can't talk about testimony. we know that a slave is not kosher to be a witness from the fact that a woman can't be a witness. Why not? It's just like a woman who is she's kosher, she can marry whoever she pleases. So she's still invalid to serve as a witness. A slave that cannot marry whoever he chooses certainly cannot be a kosher witness. By the way, why are women excluded from testimony? Because the verse states, "There'll be two men," and those two men are referring to the witnesses, and men as opposed to children or women. Okay, therefore, if a woman can't serve as a witness, a slave cannot serve as a witness either, because a slave can't marry whoever he pleases, as opposed to a woman who could marry. A kosher woman could marry whoever she pleases. So the Gemara says, well, a woman and a slave are still slightly different. What's the difference? You're telling me that a woman, she's much more Jewish, let's say, than a slave. Why? Because she can marry whoever she pleases. She has and yet she's still invalid to be a witness. And if a slave can't marry whoever he pleases, certainly he shouldn't be able to be a witness. The problem is that difference is belied by the fact that there are other things that a slave has that a woman doesn't. For example, a slave is circumcised, and a woman is obviously not. So clearly, the fact that the woman is able to marry whoever she pleases is not the trigger that determines the fact that she, in every which way, has more laws applied to her, more restrictions than a slave. And that's because, despite the fact that the slave is limited with who he can marry, he still has to get a circumcision. So Gemara says, okay, you're right. We have to prove it from a child. Why? Because a boy, he does have circumcision, and yet he can't serve as a witness. Therefore, a slave that also has circumcision also would be invalid for testimony. And also, there's another point here, which is that a child also does not have the same level of commandments as a slave. They're similar in that regard. A slave has to follow the same commandments that a woman has to follow. A child has less commandments as well. And we see that despite the fact that he is required to have circumcision, he's still not kosher to be a witness. So Mara says, Malakot she'enim mitzvahs. A child has no mitzvahs whatsoever, whereas a slave does have mitzvahs. A child is someone who's not mature yet, he's not commanded in any mitzvahs. Obviously, we teach him, but he's not commanded. Whereas a slave does have commandments. Therefore, it makes sense that even though a child would not be valid to be a witness, a slave would be valid. So the Gemara says, okay, well, we'll learn a combination. A woman will prove it. She does have commandments, and she's not kosher to be a witness. The point is, neither a slave is not perfectly analogous to either a woman or a child, right? Why are they not analogous to a woman? Because a slave has a bris, a circumcision. Why is he not the same as a child? Because he has commandments. The slave has commandments, the child doesn't. So let's learn it from a combination of both of them. What's the common denominator? They don't have all the mitzvahs, and they're not kosher to be a witness. And the key feature here is not circumcision, because a child is circumcised and also is not kosher to be a witness. So therefore, I say that anybody who does not have all the mitzvahs, he is not kosher to be a witness. And an Eved fits into that category. Let's A slave does not have all the is not obligated with all the mitzvahs. And he is invalid for a witness testimony. So Gemara says, no. Okay, there's a problem here. What's the problem? The problem is that there is a common denominator that a woman and a child have that a slave does not have, and that is, are they called a man? A woman is not called a man, and neither is a child called a man. And what's so critical about being called a man is that word man, anoshim, is the key word used in the context of witnesses. So it basically undermines the whole argument, right? We're telling me that there's sort of a set of similarities that should determine whether or not you're kosher for testimony, but we're ignoring the key factor. The Torah says men, and neither a woman nor a child is a man, whereas a slave is a man. And therefore, despite the fact that a slave and a child and a woman are not kosher for testimony, it stands to reason that a slave would be kosher for testimony. So back to the original question. According to the rabbis that define a slave as a brother, how do they know he's not kosher to be a witness? Yeah? Okay. So the Gemara realigns. We'll go with the same framework as we just did before, but we'll realign it slightly. We learn it from a thief. A thief is not kosher for testimony, so too a slave is not kosher for testimony. What's the problem there?
The thief might have the commandments.
Well, then certainly. Well, if a thief who has commandments is still not kosher for testimony, a slave which doesn't have as many commandments for sure shouldn't be kosher. What's the flaw in the reasoning? Flaw is very simple. The reason why a thief is not kosher for testimony is nothing intrinsic, like a slave. It's because he's a thief. He's performed something to make you think that there should be a problem with him. Right? Maligazlan shekain ma'asav garmalai. Timer be'evet she'ein ma'asav garmalai. You have this perfectly kosher slave, right? Let's say like Tavi, this slave of Rabbi Gamliel. Very good kosher slave. Why would we think he's not kosher for testimony? Because the low life in the street who's a shoplifter and a mugger is not kosher? It's totally incomparable. The reason why a thief is not any intrinsic problem that a slave has. So the Gemara says you're right. It's learned out of a combination of a thief together with a woman or a child. And the idea here is the idea here is that 1 second. Yeah. The idea here is they're not, it's instead of not being eligible for some mitzvahs, it's that they don't actually keep some mitzvahs. A thief doesn't keep some mitzvahs because he's an idiot and he's a thief. And a woman doesn't keep some mitzvahs. Why? Because she's exempt. And similarly for a slave. But the common denominator still fits. It's that they don't keep some mitzvahs and they're not kosher to be a witness. And both a thief and a woman have another thing going for them. These people can marry whoever they want. A slave cannot. So if these people who can marry whoever they want, when they don't keep some mitzvahs, they become exempt. They become exempt. They become disqualified from testifying. So too, a slave who isn't even able to marry whoever he wants, certainly, and he's limited by the amount of commandments he keeps, certainly should be invalid to be a slave. Okay, to be a witness. Okay, let's continue. Next Gemara is a bit little bit challenging. Mar Ravina. Mar, the son of Ravina, has an alternative. Okay. Let's just give a little bit of background here before we start. The verse states that fathers won't die because of their sons, sons won't die because of their fathers. A man will die because of his own sin. Okay. Another point of this is that a father and a son can't testify for each other. A father can't testify to kill his son. A son can't testify to kill his father. Okay. With regard to a slave, someone who's born from a slave and a slave's child, neither of them have yichus, meaning we don't consider the slave is considered to be the son of the child of his mother, but not the child of his father. This is unlike both a Jew and a non-Jew, who are considered the children of their father.
Say again, who is not considered the children of their father?
Nobody ever knows who their father is until modern genetics, right?
True.
It's always a presumption.
Yeah.
The presumption is given to Jews.
Okay.
To a much, much lesser extent, it also refers to non-Jews.
Okay.
By a slave, there's no such presumption.
Presumption being.
There is no. In the case of a slave, you're talking about a highly promiscuous segment of the society.
Okay.
So there is no presumptive father.
All right.
And the same thing is true in the. But it's not just the promiscuity that it's also the Torah decrees that we don't consider the father to be the father.
Mm.
The same thing is true of the slave's children. If the slave, is a slave and he has, he hangs around the maidservant's quarter.
Who knows how many offspring he's got by how many women?
Exactly. So the law is that his children, even if he actually knows who they are, or thinks he knows who they are not considered his children. There's no yichus. There's no paternal relationship, and that goes both up and down.
Okay.
Now, with regard to a convert, it's a bit tricky. So let's go as follows. Let's explain as follows. A convert is not considered to be we're on 88A, and we're about 7-8 lines from the wider lines. Okay, a convert's yichus is as follows. Once he converts, he's not considered a child of his father. He's considered to be a new person. Similarly, if he has children that converted with him, they also are not considered to be, he is not considered to be their father. But if he has children after he converted, those children are considered his own children. And again, we're talking here on the masculine side. Although the truth is that if you converted, a person would not consider his mother to be his mother either. Because once a person converts, he becomes like a new person. Okay. Marbar Ravina Omar Kra, the verse states, La Yumsu Avis Albanim. What does this mean? Another interpretation is La Yumsu Al Pi Avis She'enam Lahem Chayes Banim. Children cannot be killed by the testimony of somebody who doesn't have a father. So meaning Avis here doesn't actually mean a father, it means somebody who has paternal lineage. Who's an example of somebody who doesn't have paternal lineage? A slave. Okay. The fathers won't die with the testimony of their sons. That's the simple explanation of the verse. So then fathers shouldn't die because of their own son's testimony. My banim, what does sons mean? As if it's sort of two independent categories. There are fathers and sons. Because if we're talking about the children of the father, we would say b'neihem, their children belonging to them. But it's not what the verse says. It says fathers and sons, not that the sons belong to the fathers. Obviously, this tells me that fathers means someone with a father, with paternity, with paternal lineage. Yichus. Who's somebody who doesn't have paternity lineage? That would be a slave. So the Gemara says, that the problem is the verse repeats itself. The verse says, and children shouldn't die because of their fathers. That children that don't have lineage should not be eligible to be witnesses either. If that's the case, so therefore, a convert should be not kosher to be a witness because his children don't share, are not considered paternally related to him if they converted with him. Okay, now I'm just going to skip to the I'm gonna what's it called? The spoiler alert. Okay, I'm going to spoil this for you. I'm just going to get to Gemara's conclusions so you sort of understand where we're going to. Ultimately, the Gemara will say that because the first half of the verse says that fathers won't layomsu aves habanim, that's why the verse flips around and says banim layomsu aves, but not to tell me anything unique. But we're not there yet. So now it is coming to tell me something unique. So let's see it. Okay, so the Gemara proposes that the key idea it's telling me is that if you would not have paternity to your child, then you're not eligible to be a witness either, and that would refer to a convert. But the problem is that a convert is eligible to be a witness. A ger can serve as a witness. So Amri, the Gemara says, there's no comparison. Well, it's true that a convert, at the time he converts, loses his paternity, right, both above and below, but when he does have a child after he converts, that child is considered his paternal son. As a slave never has lineage, not above, not below. Because let's say the Torah was trying to invalidate a convert for testimony. So then what should we should have written as follows. Fathers shouldn't die because of the testimony of their own sons. And then the Torah should flip around and write, and sons should not die because of their fathers. That would tell me two things. Number one, fathers and sons can't testify for each other. And number two, people that don't have sons, like converts, because there were sons that were born before they converted, are not considered paternally connected to them. One second. They're also excluded for testimony. And a slave, and a slave we would learn from a convert. And we would say as follows: if a convert, which is required to follow all of the Torah's laws, right, and even though he lacks most of his paternity, yichus, he does have a little bit. If he has a child after he converts, the child is paternally connected to him. Despite all that, he's not kosher to be a witness. So if that was the case, then for sure a slave that has no paternity at all whatsoever and doesn't either have the full set of commandments, for sure should be invalid to be a witness. So I wouldn't need the Torah to indicate to me that a slave is invalid to be a witness, because I can learn it from a convert. The fact that Torah did not write that. A slave that has no lineage whatsoever, he is not kosher to be a witness, and that explains the first half of the verse. Sons and fathers are considered two separate entities. Why? Because we don't refer to fathers, we refer to people that have the concept of fatherness, paternity, and that excludes a slave who does not have the concept of paternity. He does not have, because he does not have the concept of paternity, therefore he's not kosher to be a witness. But a convert that does have lineage, he can be a kosher witness. And if you'll say, that sons, 1 second. Okay. So the second half of the verse, which says, sons shouldn't die for their fathers. It should indicate to us, and sons shouldn't die because of their fathers, not because of the concept of fatherness. Because if that were the case, we would actually focus on the concept of sonness, meaning the concept of paternity again. And we would say that a slave, a convert that does not have paternity to his son, that was born before he converted, can't be a witness. So but we said he could be a witness. So the verse should be indicating sons shouldn't die because of their fathers. Why does it say Banim and Ovis in the abstract, not connected to each other? The mashmal in the second half of the verse, the mashmal Yom Tzal Banim Shein Ovis, that seems to imply that a convert should be excluded from testimony. So the Gemara says, "I because of Yom Tzal Ovis Abanim, because of Nami Ubanim Yom Tzal Ovis," because the first half of the verse uses Ovis and Banim, fathers and sons, and does not connect them. The second half of the verse also doesn't connect them, and it says Banim and Ovis, sons and fathers, but not necessarily to exclude a convert. Okay, that ends a more difficult Gemara. Let's continue. Second to bottom line of 88a.
I got it.
No, it's not a god. It's not a god. But it's not that difficult. We have a major story that happens here. So Cherashad of Cotton B'Giyas and Raw. If you happen to get into a fight with a deaf mute, a person who's psychotically deranged, or a cotton or a child, you're in bad shape. Why? Because you injure them, you have to pay. If they injure you, they're exempt. Okay, now we get to a very interesting story. Try to keep track of the relatives here. Ime Rav Shmuel bar Abba, the son of Rav Shmuel, the mother of Rav Shmuel bar Abba. So obviously we have two people here. We have a Nesivas Leila Rav Abba. So she was actually the mother that was married to his father. So right, Shmuel has a father, mother, married to each other. What happens? Shmuel's mother, she writes off all of her assets. Remember, this is Nichse Malug, to her son Shmuel. Pasuk the Shriva, then she passed away. So Ozar of Shmuel bar Abba Kamma of Yirmiyah. Kamma of Yirmiyah bar Abba. So Shmuel comes in front of his brother, Rabbi Yirmiyah, the son of the same father. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says, okay, you're the son, your mother gave you all her assets, now she passed away, you get to keep the assets. Also, Rabbi Abba, so Rabbi Abba came along. Rabbi Abba is, remember, Shmuel's father. Shmuel's father was, in other words, what happened was here, typically a woman is inherited by her father, by her husband. Over here, she went ahead and gave her inheritance to her son Shmuel. So Shmuel says the money's mine. Shmuel's father says, Abba says the money's mine. I inherited her. She had no right to give it to you. He said it's to Rav Hoshe. So Rav Hoshe didn't know what to do. So Rav Hoshe Amar Kamei Rav Yehudah. He went and said to told us to Rav Yehudah. So Amar Rav Yehudah said, Hachi Amar Shmuel. This is what Shmuel said. Shmuel presumably is not the same person as Rav Shmuel, who is the protagonist of the story. So the protagonist of the story is Rav Shmuel. They went to Rav Yehudah. Rav Yehudah quotes Shmuel. Shmuel, remember, is the contemporary of Rav, who's different than the protagonist, different person. They have the same name, but different person. One we call Rav Shmuel, one we call Shmuel. This is what Shmuel said. A woman sells nichse malug while her husband's still alive, umesa, and then she dies. The husband can confiscate it from the potential buyers. Okay, in other words, the woman sells her assets. This would be no different than the mother of Shmuel giving her assets to Shmuel. Mm-hmm. And the husband can collect the assets after she dies and keep it. The husband inherits her. She can't give away the assets while she's still alive. So Amru Kamei Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba. So this halachic ruling got back to Rabbi Yirmiyah, the brother of Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Abba, who had previously ruled that the halacha followed Shmuel. The halacha followed Rav Shmuel. The assets belonged to Rav Shmuel. So Amar Lahu, say Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba was perplexed. He said, I know a Mishnah, a Brisa. Mishnah. What's the Mishnah? The time we learned. Okay, so let's make a story here. Yaakov Avinu, obviously he's the father, right? He has a son Reuben. Maybe he has a son Shimon, Levi, and Yehudah also. Okay, so what did Yaakov do? He said, I'm giving all my assets to Reuben. Okay, he said Reuben only gets to keep the assets after I die. Okay, in English, what we're really heading here is to the story of Kinyan Peres, Kinyan Aguf, or Lav Kinyan Aguf. What does that mean? In this case, Yaakov says to Reuven, my son Reuven, I'm giving you my assets after I die. That means that I'm giving you the property now, but you don't have the right to benefit from the property. The benefit is mine until I die. The benefit's Yaakov, the father's, until he dies. Reuven has nothing but the land without the fruits of it. Yaakov has the fruit without the land. And the question is, which ownership is considered primary? The use of the item or the ownership of the item itself without its use. So now let's just break this down. So now if we say the ownership of the item without its use is primary, Reuven can now sell it. Let's say Reuven sells it to me. Okay. And then Reuven dies, and then Yaakov dies. Do we say, well, Yaakov's now dead, so it goes to Reuven, which I bought it from, so I get to keep it? Or do we say, no, Reuven had no right to sell it. Therefore, the inheritors of Yaakov, which would be Shimon, Levi, and Yehudah, they'd get to keep it, and not me. King in Paris is Kikinyan Aguf Dami. If the use of the item is considered the main use, then it belongs to Yaakov. Reuven had no right to sell it. If Reuven dies, then there's no way for me, the buyer from Reuven, to be connected to the item, and it goes to the inheritors of Yaakov. Now, one more catch there. Important to understand. Let's say Reuven was still alive. Yaakov dies first. So then Reuven gets to keep it. Following, right, Yaakov says after he dies, Reuven gets it. So now it's handed over to Reuven. Because Reuven sold it to me, so he has to hand over the field to me as well. You got it?
Yep.
And that would be according to all opinions. Okay. So he writes off all his assets to his son after he dies. The son can't sell it because the property is in the domain of the father. And the father can't sell it because they're given to his son. Okay, let's examine. Let's say the father did sell it anyway. The sale is valid until he dies. Let's say the son sold it. The buyer from Reuven, if Yaakov sells it, the buyer gets to eat the fruit until he dies, until Yaakov dies. The buyer from Reuven gets it after Yaakov dies. Well, that's when Reuven would have gotten it. That's when the buyer gets it. Okay, Kimayis Av, but when the father dies, Mia is Lekech. Then the father, when the father dies, the buyer gets to keep it. In other words, if the father dies, the buyer, Reuven gets it, and Reuven has to hand it over to the buyer. And that would be the case even if Reuven is already dead. So in other words, Yaakov sells it to Reuven, Reuven sells it to Beryl. Okay, then Reuven dies. Then Yaakov dies. Now Beryl gets to keep the property.
He has both the fruit and the property.
I'm sorry?
He has both the fruit and the
So
property.
in other words, after Yaakov dies, the property goes to deceased Reuven.
Mhm.
And because deceased Reuven sold it previously to Beryl when he dies, so it goes to Beryl. Even though Reuven actually never possessed the property. Why did Reuven not possess the property? Because Reuven was dead. Reuven's death occurred prior to the death of Yaakov. It still goes to Beryl, the buyer of Reuven. And this is the opinion of Shimon Lakish. The Amar Loishna Mesa Haben B'chai Av Loyas Liyoda Ben Loishna Mesa Av B'chai Haben Also Ben Kollel. It makes no difference whether Reuven was alive at the time that Yaakov died. If Reuven is alive at the time Yaakov dies, it goes to Reuven and then to Beryl. If Reuven's not alive, it also goes to Beryl. Doesn't make a difference. By the way, Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. He says, the Itmar we learned, this is a famous debate between Rabbi Yochanan and Shlakish. Rabbi Yochanan says that if Reuven dies while the father is still alive, Yaakov is still alive, then the buyer Beryl does not get the property. Why not? When the Mishnah says Rabbi Yochanan says that when the Mishnah says the son dies, when the Mishnah says the father dies, it must be that the son was still alive. Because if the son was dead at the time, if Reuven dies first, then Yaakov dies, Beryl does not get to keep the property. Why? Alma Kasavar, can you Paris, can you Naguftam? Rabbi Yochanan says the use of the property is the main ownership, not the fact that you own the property without its use. Therefore, Reuven had no ability to sell it until he actually gets it. And because Reuven never got it, because Reuven was deceased at the time Yaakov dies, Therefore, Beryl doesn't get it either. However, Rav Shimon Melakish does not hold of this distinction. Rav Shimon Melakish are Kollel lekach, the buyer does acquire. Kitanim azis and machar av ein lekach at yom av kimayis av miyas is lekach leshon lo yemesa haben b'chay av the osli yod ben leshon mesa b'chay av the osli yod ben Kollel lekach. It doesn't make a difference whether the son died when Yaakov was alive or did not die. Regardless, it goes to the buyer. Beryl, why alma kasaver can you paris lav can you gluftaming? He says owning the use is not like owning the property. In other words, in this case, Reuben actually owns the property for when his father dies. And that's what he sold to Beryl, and that sale is valid. And it makes no difference if Reuben's alive at the time that Yaakov passes away or he's already dead. Okay. Okay, we'll have to review this and take off again tomorrow. Okay, have a great day.
Actually, go out.
We'll hear it tomorrow. We'll compare it.